Without further ado, we'll start with Phil, Chief Fire Officer of Merseyside Fire and Rescue Service, great supporter of AFSA. And I think, Phil, you've got a few slides to use, so over to you.
Indeed, that first one wasn't one of mine, though, I'll hasten to add.
Sorry, Phil, I dug that one out, sorry.
Yeah, thanks very much, Mo. So I think we can move off from that slide in the first instance. Yeah, look, I've got 15 minutes and I've been asked to talk about inclusive leadership at the time of crisis and particularly in relation to COVID. So as I said, I'm not sure how familiar people are with the role that I've been fulfilling for the past number of months, but I've been fire goal nationally in support of in the coordination response to COVID. So, you know, that the whole multitude of issues has come my way at points in time, and we've sought to draw that into the service and then share it for chief officers to be able to apply it into the workplace. And it's been vast and it's been, you know, varied, and you know, and some of those things have been related to and how we've responded to diversity challenges and so on and so forth. So that's a bit broadly the context, and I'm more than happy to talk about any part of the work that we're involved in and any part of the information that's been presented to me at points in time. So, you know, please feel free to utilise the chat as it's been suggested to ask many questions. But actually, you know, the purpose of the presentation, we'll talk about a little bit around inclusive leadership and my views and my perspectives on how that's related to COVID-19. Okay, so I thought it'd be useful to start by looking to define what we thought inclusive leadership is, and you know, and I'll draw out little aspects of it, particularly around biases as we go through the presentation. So what it says is leaders who are aware of their own biases and preferences and actively seek out and consider different views and perspectives to inform better decision making. They see diverse talent as a source of competitive advantage and inspire diverse people to drive the organisation forward. I think that's really quite important in the first instance to get that out there. And what do I look at from an inclusive leadership perspective? Making things happen, I suppose, is the best way to describe that. Asking questions, not only of myself in regards to how I lead, but also in regards to, you know, the questions I would pose to others in supporting that diversity of thought. Important we frame up what inclusive leadership is in the first instance, and that's trying to draw out and trying to include people in the decision making, and really, you know, the strength of an organisation and its diversity. And I've said from a Merseyside perspective, but also a National Fire Chiefs Council perspective, the more diverse the organisation is, the more it reflects the communities it serves, the better it is at reflecting the challenges that it faces. And that's been self-evident in relation to the sector's response to COVID. Okay, so I suppose it's important, if you're reflecting on the biases and understanding your biases. And society will have biases, individually you have biases, and it talks about inclusive leadership of understanding and knowing them. You know, I suppose a self-reflection for myself is, you know, I'm not even sure I do know all of my biases. You know, I try and work really hard to. But if they are really unconscious, then I'm sure I haven't unearthed all of them at this moment in time. But we probably recognise that there's a number of biases that could affect the decisions that we make. Affinity bias, so what are we talking about there? We tend to associate with individuals we believe are like us, as opposed to those who don't identify with. Okay, so we surround ourselves with people who say, look and behave in the same way. And that's, you know, I suppose that's, you know, that does... You know, there's a lot of people who do that. You know, it's a real reflection of yourself, and you don't recognise the strengths of other individuals. You think that everyone needs to look and behave like you. That's quite dangerous in regard to leading an organisation. Confirmation bias, so we tend only to consider the information that confirms our point of view. Funny enough, with the the upsurgence around social media, it's very easy to be drawn into that. You surround yourself with and follow people who are all confirming what you think rather than challenging some of your thought processes. Again, really dangerous place to be when you are trying to lead an organisation through. And then, you know, personality error bias. We assume individuals' behaviours core to their personality without considering external factors. So we make assumptions. So, you know, we wrap people around that look like us, behave like us. We confirm stuff based on, I don't know, not the full picture, you know, and we assume things about individuals, and recognising some of those biases and trying to challenge them in how we discharge our responsibilities has been key to my leadership style, but also how we've tried to respond to COVID.
Just to interrupt for a second, just explain to us how you use that knowledge of affinity bias to avoid affinity bias.
I suppose I go back to Jack to not surrounding yourselves with people who act and behave in the same way as you do, and sometimes that's a real challenge. And what I describe as a diversity of thought, really. And Matthew Syed, who wrote Rebel Ideas, does it really, really well, and kind of draws out the benefit of having a diverse group of individuals, all with views and that psychological safety around people being able to express those views. So yeah, I think it's recognising it in the first instance, and then looking to ensure that you don't surround yourself with people who think and act and behave in the same way. And it really is that diversity of thought. And actually it can come from a diversity of thought through characteristics, or it can come through a diversity of experience and environment people operate within and are brought up in. And having that rich picture allows you to make better decisions. Okay, so I suppose you only have to go to Channel 4 to look at the title of this particular slide. So we've talked about the biases, we've talked about how we respond to bias. So the question was posed via television around, is COVID racist? And I'll probably maybe reframe it to some degree and say, is COVID bias? Is it knowingly bias? Is it intentionally bias? But nevertheless, how is it disproportionately affecting certain communities other than others? And then I relate you back into the previous slide. So some of the data that we've received over the course of the last number of months would suggest that people of black ethnic backgrounds were higher risk, and it's also reinforced in some of the data that was to follow around intensive national care audit research that showed 34% of COVID-related admissions to intensive care were from BAME people. Whilst only
so Phil, just to interrupt again there, let's apply that to the Fire and Rescue Service. So how the Fire Rescue Service recognised in the early days when the NHS was saying the first 6 deaths of workers were all BAME, all Muslim, and all of a certain age. How did the Fire and Rescue Service, NFCC, react to that?
There's a real good question then, Jack Tar. I suppose it's like anything else. That information, that intelligence coming into the Fire and Rescue Service at the time was distributed across all services. I suppose you don't necessarily need that to be shared by the NFCC. We are all watching the television. We're also all absorbing that media frenzy. And again, I put it as a frenzy because it really is focused, and sometimes the media can take you down the wrong path, and it really is about exploring whether it's valid, it's accurate, it's a true reflection what the circumstances were. But certainly in those early stages around BAME people being disproportionately affected by COVID, the Fire and Rescue Service did respond, and quite rightly did. And that's that little bit of that internal look about, okay, so if this is telling us that people are more vulnerable or more susceptible to the virus, is there something that we can do about that? Irrespective of whether it's factually correct, certainly that emergent intelligence told us that. So services across the board took to reflect on that in regards to the makeup of the whole workforce. So where there was a disproportionate impact, whether we could lessen that impact by that kind of internal risk assessment associated with role, task, but also individual. And really getting into the individual, but equally starting the conversations with individuals.
Great reply, Matt, Phil, great reply. The one thing that I tried to use was our knowledge of the Fire and Rescue Service of targeting the messages to the right people. So there was the issue of targeting, which we've got knowledge of, try to share that with the NHS. The other one is which I urge NFC members to try to push wider knowledge, is the concept of risk assessment and dynamic risk assessment. That knowledge is not out there in the general public and the general community. So if we could educate our colleagues in the NHS for dynamic risk assessment, that would also be helpful. So thank you for that.
Yeah, absolutely. And the other thing I would say is we utilised our our network, so our BAME network particularly, in regards to sense checking some of our thinking. So if we did this, would this be effective? Would this have the desired impact? We wrote to all of our staff just to recognise the fact that actually, you know what, this is an emergent issue. It's been flagged up. There's some concerns being expressed. How does that feel for you? Is there things that we can do as an organisation which would limit that potential impact on you as an individual? And then it starts that open dialogue between the service, the network, and and BAME staff, who were probably at that particular point in time a little concerned, a little worried, not only for themselves but their families, about the transmission of the virus. And it was about trying to provide that level of assurance that in that risk assessed way, we would consider it in that context. We would take it as a real genuine concern for an individual, and if there was some things that we could do to negate that, then we would. So that's probably the approach that we adopted. But at that time, you will recall, that was a real issue. Now actually, and again, I stand to be corrected here, but as time has gone by, certainly circumstances have changed and situations change and at-risk groups change. There's a whole reason and a whole multiple layers of factors, I think, which have affected that. So this is a slide around the factors associated with COVID-19, particularly focused in on BAME colleagues. But the fact of the matter is, what I'm probably describing is a multitude of factors which make you more vulnerable. And so then I turn around and say, okay, so is it related to the reason why some of our BAME staff have been more susceptible to COVID over the course of the last 10 months, or certainly in the first stages? Was it down to the fact that they were from BAME communities? Or is it something else? Or is it something more deep-seated societally around the causes for concern? So you work your way through the circles. Some of them are evidence is known, some of them is limited evidence, some has indirect evidence, and some of it's not known, but there's certainly some reason to suggest that there's an implication here. The bits that'll draw out, which kind of reinforce, I suppose, to some degree, the point that I'm trying to make is it down to the colour of someone's skin, of why they are susceptible, or is it something else? And is it those structural, societal factors? The first one I draw your attention to, irrespective of the lifestyle, of course, lifestyles are, I suppose, a generic, an individual choice. Smoking, that's how you were referencing the physical activity and how you manage yourself to some degree, all quite correct. Arguably within an individual's capability to make that decision themselves. Deprivation is somewhat different. And I work in a service where we have probably the highest levels of deprivation in the country in comparison. And with deprivation comes an inequality, and an inequality across a range of areas. So it's no surprise when we look at COVID-19 and the impact that COVID-19 has had on communities, those people in deprived communities have been more susceptible to the virus.
Well, again, this is an absolutely brilliant slide. When I saw it yesterday, I wanted to share it with everyone. I urge people to look through this, because we could spend a full 45 minutes on all of this. But there's no surprises under COVID-19 for the Fire and Rescue Service. We know the greatest fire deaths have always occurred in the same sort of postcode areas, and it's always the overlaying factors of housing, unemployment, deprivation are the key factors. And again, the NHS didn't listen when the likes of myself and Steve McGurk were highlighting this to the NHS, saying, target your interventions, target your messages to these postcode areas. They tried to go through with a generic message. But this is a fantastic slide. I urge you all to look at it in detail and share it with colleagues.
Yeah, look, thanks, Jack Tar. And again, I don't intend to go through every one of the circles, but what I do intend to do is pick out the bits and the most salient bits, I think, from a Fire and Rescue Service point of view, but also the kind of context of the virus. The virus isn't racist. The virus is a virus. It's the fact of the matter. It attacks people who are more susceptible for a variety of reasons. Deprivation, being one of the key ones. And you can put deprivation, and you can probably segment that to a greater or lesser degree, but what the evidence suggests is if you live in a more deprived area, you're more susceptible to the transmission of the virus. Age, age, we all age at various points in time, so I will probably leave age for the time being. Obesity, again, maybe not necessarily specific around BMI or whatever else, irrespective of your race or anything else for that matter. Structural discrimination is an interesting one though, and how that impacts on individuals, particularly from BAME communities, I would suggest, and that has a real adverse impact. If you don't think you're being listened to, you're not being heard, you go back to those biases and people who are making decisions, looking and acting and behaving in one way. And then
just to support you there, Phil, there's David Williams' research in Harvard University talks about particularly microaggressions on individuals that are different, could be women in the fire service, could be BAME individuals, leads to 10 to 15 years less life expectancy. This is not overt racism, this is the microaggression, the little things that hurt you, but you go away, don't think about. 10-year difference, more susceptible to cancer. So we have to tackle the microaggressions.
Absolutely. So, and again, and it probably leads directly onto the next one, which is around behaviour. And behaviour is, again, a product. You behave in a way based on the environments in which you operate within, whether that's through structural discrimination or areas of deprivation, whether it's education, whatever it is. We're seeing behaviours certainly in the more deprived areas be a little different than they have been elsewhere. And so I'm speaking from the heart here. So what you see is people being less compliant in more deprived areas, or you did originally, and less so more latterly. But actually, the flip side of that is, as you get into the more affluent areas now, and the virus has been in this country for a long protracted period of time, some of the more middle class areas are being a little bit dismissive of the situation, and the rules that were in place now don't apply to them. And again, it's some of that societal, but it's behaviours built up over the environment in which an individual operates within. Environment pollution, so you link in susceptibility to pollution and so on and so forth, of course. So again, linking into to BAME groups, particularly the type of occupation. You're new into the UK and some of the challenges that individuals who are new entrants into our country. It's more of a challenge, and some of those kind of roles and responsibilities, and that leads to more susceptibility there. Housing, and again, we talk about Leicestershire and so on and so forth, and cultural influences here. Large households living together, that certainly had an impact on COVID transmission. But you know what? They're cultural choices. Some of them are, some of them aren't. Some of them are linked to high levels of deprivation. Okay, so how do we and what do we do in response then? So I think it's important. I'll just pick the large proportion. So build cultural intelligence. Do we need to know as fire and rescue service? We need to understand what and why certain things happen, and that being curious and learning through crisis. And what I would encourage anyone to do is to ask and explore. Like, don't sit on, don't assume. Ask the people who are affected by some of these inequalities directly. And certainly in putting this presentation together, I sat for probably an hour or so with my BAME network lead and asked them a whole raft of stupid questions, questions that I probably thought I probably should know, but I had, flip across to the other side. I had the courage to ask them in the first instance, to expose myself for not knowing. And I think that's important from an organisational point of view. We ask the stupid questions because if we don't, we end up getting the answers wrong. So, be curious, reimagine how your organisation works with, its staff, its people, its communities. Remain committed to building that inclusive culture. Have courage to hold yourself and others to account. And if I'm honest with you, as the Chief of Merseyside, holding myself to account is probably the most important bit. Am I getting this right? Am I, demonstrating biases? Am I, listening? Am I engaging? Am I really considered and understand the impact of the actions that I take on the service that I lead? And then be cognizant of those biases, because they become blind spots if you're not. Okay, so how can you do that? I suppose I'll just pick up the main bits. Fairness, okay, and fairness and an equality of service, but also recognising that there's there is inequalities that exist out in communities, but also in organisations, and reflecting them in the things and the actions we take. Creating that sense of belonging, that real sense of belonging about why we're here, what we're here to do. You know, the fact that staff feel cared for, feel looked after, feel included, feel considered. You know, we respond to what they're saying rather than dismissive. And then, you know, inspiring that across all staff, and certainly inspiring staff to be able to speak up and have that psychological safety, so they know that what they're saying has been listened to, and importantly, what they're saying is not only being listened to, but it's being heard. And I think it's important then that the service goes on to explain what it's doing in a manner that can be consumed by the whole organisation. So I'll probably draw it to a conclusion, Jethar, at that particular juncture.
Now, Phil, thank you very much.